Okay, okay, everybody. Thank you for coming here once again. This is our March 19th presentation night, second meeting of March. Thank you for everybody that's here in person. We've also got a good sized group that's out here on Zoom. So thank you once again for joining us. And tonight we have a really special presentation from Eric Hagemann on advanced lighting masking. For a lot of us who have been working with Lightroom for several years, we know that it was just over the last couple of years that we've been able to bring masking into our Lightroom process, reducing how much that we have to go do over in Photoshop. There's still sometimes where that makes sense, but it's pretty amazing just some of the advancements that have come along with regards to Lightroom, making it much easier in that. So tonight we have Eric, who's going to share some of those masking techniques, including some of the advanced masking techniques that will be greatly appreciated for all of us who use Lightroom for our photo editing. Couple of other things that I wanted to just bring up that are upcoming. We've got, let's see, Nature's Educators Wildlife, various birds. That's in Florence. That's still a little over a month away, April 26th, I guess that is. And that's a full day on a Saturday in Florence. And sounds like a really good opportunity to photograph birds. There's 12 birds altogether. Some of them are birds that we don't normally get the opportunity to photograph. And there will be 6 of those, I believe, that they're going to include in-flight opportunities for photographs. So even if you haven't done a whole lot of bird photography, there will be some people there that have done a lot of bird photography that, while it's not a formal workshop, still will share their knowledge and help you out to get some amazing images, I'm sure.
Yes, for people who don't want to get up early and drive that distance, several of us are going to go there the night before.
Okay.
So we won't have to drive.
Okay, yeah, so some people are going to go down there. Is there a place like outside of Florence or something like that, that there's a place to stay at so that you don't have to get up at 3 in the morning like
Michael.
like we're some of us are used to doing?
Actually staying at Supermax.
Okay, that's right. Florence, there you go.
Yeah.
There's also the Denver powwow. This is out on our email that just went out March 21st through 23rd. A couple of other things that are coming up. It was also out on the email today that went out today. The Louisville photo contest entries are due next week. I think it's March 31st, the end of the month. And more information out there. There's a link that's out there on the email that went out today. Tonight's presenter, Eric Hagemann, was going to mention he's got in May, the Southwest Photo Club has a free meeting. They're going to be doing this over Zoom, and it will give you the opportunity. They're going to have manufacturers from the various camera manufacturers that are going to be presenting, and they'll have a special breakout sessions in that. So via Zoom, and if you're a Nikon shooter, then you get to go to that breakout room. If you're a Sony shooter, you go to another breakout room. I'm assuming there will be one for Canon and
OM.
Okay. So that I didn't have the exact date on it. You mentioned that
It'll be the 8th,
okay.
if I remember right. And you'll have emails by next week that like Bruce and whoever else that you guys can distribute. We have it up on our website so everybody can check it out.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Open to everybody that owns a camera and wants to be involved. There's no restriction, no, just gotta register for the Zoom meeting.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity for that. Let's see here. The other things that are coming up here that I had on my list. April 2nd, the competition, leading lines. I still need to get a judge for that one, but we'll have that wrapped up here in the next couple of days.
We do have a judge.
You do have the one for this one?
Cheryl Opperman.
Oh, is she doing the leading line one? Okay, that takes some pressure off of me. Good. Okay, so Cheryl Opperman, who actually is also the judge for, this is the other thing that's coming up, right, is the Exploring the Light opening reception is Saturday the 29th, 4 to 6 p.m. A great event, and that opening reception is always a good thing to go to in that. The information about our presenter tonight, Eric Hagemann. After a 36-year career in public sector engineering and organizational strategy, he's focused full-time on uncovering dynamic and thought-provoking images. Currently, his interested in exploring and capturing the diverse landscape of the Western U.S., from the rugged mountains and plains of Colorado to the arid deserts of Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, both black and white and color, obviously, and then also infrared. So he and I were just talking a few minutes ago here a little bit about infrared, something that I dabble in here and there. So looking forward to seeing his images tonight that they'll be demonstrating. He's been exhibiting and selling his work since 2010. He's been in galleries since 2015 and has participated in many local and nationwide shows. And as we just heard, he's got images over here in the Lone Tree show that's coming up here in the next couple of weeks. He's also been awarded the Leica Master Shot designation twice and has achieved honorable mention in the PX3 nominee status in the Spider Awards. So with that, I'll open up. I don't know if there's any questions. And if not, we'll go ahead and let Eric share his screen and share with us his knowledge on advanced Lightroom masking techniques.
So while we're doing this, just an informal poll. Lightroom, people are familiar with? Okay, Lightroom masking?
Sort of.
Okay, how many people have intersected masks in Lightroom? Okay, a little bit, okay. I'm gonna start with a presentation, a couple slides, and then we'll go live into Lightroom. And so it'll be a little choose your own adventure kind of once we get there. Here's my Lightroom masking moniker AI image. So Michael very quickly or nicely went through the highlights. This is my highlight slide. I will tell you, you can find me, besides the stuff you mentioned, which is all on there, you can find me on the web. I have a fine art website, which is Eric Hagemann Fine Art. That's predominantly my black and white work. I teach classes and I do some action photography, a lot of motorcycle photography in the summertime. That's on the Solstice photo site. And if you need a website, let me know, because I also build websites for people and help people kind of get online. So that's me. What I'm going to talk through tonight, I offer like 2 Lightroom masking classes. One I call an intro, which is like a full 2-hour in-depth class, and then I do an advanced one, which has a lot of extra tricks and techniques, and I actually will process like your images to kind of show you techniques on images you might be looking at using or having some issues with. So we'll start it with this, Lightroom or masking in Lightroom is very powerful. I don't know how many people appreciate how powerful it is and how much work you can do in there now. I very rarely go to Photoshop anymore. I was just in a monochrome class and the gal was pushing, everything had to be done in Photoshop. I have images I've done in Lightroom with 30 masks and it works just fine. So my statement is control the light, create the presence. It's kind of your job as the photographer to make sure that people look at the parts of the images you want them to look at and to understand the image as you present it. And by controlling the light in the image, you're able to do that, and masking kind of is the path to do that. A lot of the stuff up front should be review, hopefully, but if not, just to make sure we're all talking the same language. When you go into Lightroom and you start manipulating your images, those are called global edits because you're editing the entire image. Masking is what lets you get to local edits. And there's a lot of discussion. People will say, well, all this Photoshop stuff is going to ruin photography, and the master's always got it right in camera, and that is like the furthest thing from the truth. This is an example of a printer. This is Pablo Inirio up in New York, and he printed photos for some famous photographers. And I always like to show this image because the one on the left was the original print. The scribbles are all the instructions from the photographer back to the printer on how to reprint this in the analog darkroom. And I have this theory that before digital printing and before the internet and Facebook and all those things, to appreciate a photograph, you actually had to develop the photograph twice. You put it on a negative, and then from the negative, you took it to a positive. And but before you could show somebody, you actually had to make the print, and making the print was a whole process unto itself. And we've kind of lost that because we now take the picture and then we throw it on Facebook, and you don't do that second half of the processing anymore, right? So I think there's a mental thing. And everybody loves the quote from Ansel Adams on dodging and burning, right? So when we talk about masks, what we're really talking about is a section of your photograph is the easiest way to describe what a mask is. But again, we have a certain lingo. We'll describe things as hard masks versus soft masks, and the hardness and the softness describe the edge of the mask. In this case, on the red, so the hard mask has a hard edge. Where it's red is where the mask is, where it's white, the mask is not. And when you go from full mask to no mask, that's what the hard edge is. We'll also talk about radial gradients, and we'll also talk about linear gradients, which are places where the mask is in effect and then it fades to where the mask is not, right? Okay, so the money slide for understanding masks in Lightroom, this is the description here. You have things that are called masks, which are areas of your photographs. Those masks are made up of components. You have one of 11 types of components available to you. One of those 11 will only appear if you have a person in your photograph. And Adobe will, or Lightroom will detect that you have a person in your photograph and make that available to you. But you want to think about masks and components, and then what I call component math. If you add more than one component to your mask, they effectively add, but you can also subtract components from each other, and then you can intersect components from each other, which is where the masking gets really complex, but also extremely powerful. And I'll show you that in some examples. Once you have the area of your photograph kind of identified or selected in the mask, then you have the effect that you want to apply there. And the effect is, are you going to brighten it? Or are you going to change the contrast? Are you going to alter the colors, et cetera? So I think about it as a mask with an effect, and then the mask has these components. And I think what makes this different than Photoshop is the components in Lightroom are parametric. And what that's a fancy word for they're specified by parameters. And you can go back in and put a radial gradient in, and then you can come back in and grab that radial gradient and move it, which you can't do in Photoshop, except if you're working in Adobe Camera Raw. But if you're doing that, you're effectively talking about the same thing here. So traditional masking in Photoshop, you don't have the parameters that you can go back and edit, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit, which is why I think it makes it for me at least, the work process is much quicker, much faster. So when we talk about masks, there's another concept to introduce, and that's the overlay of the mask. So the mask is the thing that actually controls the application of the effect onto your photograph. If you're a past Photoshop person, or you may have heard the statement, black conceals, white reveals. So where it's white on the mask is where the effect is applied, and where it's black, it's not. The mask exists, but because you're in Lightroom and you don't have a separate layer mask, and you can't see the image and the layer mask separate, et cetera, Lightroom has this thing called the overlay, which is where you work 90% of the time. But the overlay is a representation of the mask. And the reason that I want to separate this out is you can actually control how the overlay looks, and its color and its opacity and other parameters. But that represents the mask, but it's not actually the mask. And I'll show that as we get into the live demonstration. By default, when you go into Lightroom, the mask is red, or the overlay is red, and it's set for 50% opacity. If red doesn't work for you, if you're challenged seeing red, or if you're editing, a photograph of a lady in a red dress or a red rose, You can choose any other color in the rainbow and make your overlay that color. And you can also change the opacity of your overlay. And then the other thing, on the right-hand side, those three little magic dots, you can select and use the color overlay, but there's 6 other modes you can view the mask in. The white on black mode at the bottom there is the one that will make that mask look like you were looking at it in Photoshop. So that's handy to know. And then before we get into the software, I like to do a deep dive into the brush a little bit. This is the utility player of all utility masking things. The brush has a size to it. It has a feather which is the edge of the brush. So if you have 0 feather, it's a hard brush. If you have 100% feather, it's a soft brush. You have a flow, which is, how much you're painting when you brush on. You can think of flow as if you've ever like physically painted something. If you had a lot of paint on the brush, that's a heavy flow. If you had a drier brush, it's a lighter flow in putting it down. You can specify the density. 100% is where I usually work, but you can also keep it down to like 50% or 75% if you don't want to fully mask out the part of your photograph. And then there's an auto mask feature, which I'll demonstrate, which is a really cool way of selecting and using the brush to get the pixels that you want to get. One of the things when you talk about the brush, I highly recommend you learn the keyboard connections and shortcuts with it. So the size of the brush is the mouse wheel on your mouse. If you're a Photoshop person, you're used to hitting the bracket keys to make your brush size bigger or smaller. In Lightroom, you just roll the mouse wheel. If you hit Shift and roll the mouse wheel, it controls the feather. If you, in the brush panel, you have 3 brushes, the A and the B brush, which can have different settings, and then you have the erase brush. The Alt key will switch you from whichever you're on, the A or B brush, over to the erase brush. And so you kind of get this Karate Kid wax on, wax off kind of thing happening. If you're trying to get, I went out on my line, I could just hit the Alt key and go back and erase what I did. And then my favorite, especially if I'm working on architecture or something, if you click the brush, move it to another part of the screen, and then hit Shift and click, it'll draw a straight line, which can be very, very useful for going around the edge of a building, like I said, or anything that has a straight edge to it that you want to draw the mask. Okay, and we'll end with so I talk about creating presence in a lot of my my talks and presentations. The statement I made earlier was you're in control of how people see your photographs. You can control what we know about humans is that humans are drawn to the brightest object when they're looking at an image or the brightest area. We are also drawn to the part of the image that's in focus, that has texture, that has interest. We look away from parts of the photograph that are blurry or out of focus. We also will look to warmer colors. So if you go warmer, the blue, the golds and the yellows, that's preferred by us, kind of biologically or whatever, than the cooler blues colors. So by using those control or those features, you can actually control how people see your image. The example up there is that's a shot of a church in Salina, Kansas. And it was made to mimic the grain silos out on the plains. That shot was taken at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a monochrome only camera. I saw the shapes of light, but it's a very, very flat image. And so what I did is I created the image in the lower right. simply through, probably about a dozen different masks in Lightroom. I also, hopefully you believe me when I change the time of day, I turn the lamp on. I wanted to make it a late evening shot, if you will, and throw emphasis, but I want to guide you into what you're seeing in that image and kind of get you to see what I envisioned when I was taking that. So that's the kind of the nutshell, the lead in. I'll pause for any questions, and then I'm going to bring up Lightroom and actually work something. So I have a very complex, beautiful image up here with two gray circles on it. And we're going to get to the gray circles in a second. But if I go into develop, the masking interface is this. Hopefully you can see my cursor. It's that little circular thing over here. And I click in that. And I'm now able to start creating masks on this. If I come out of here and I go to my basic panel, right, this is where I would do global adjustments to this image. I can brighten, I can darken it, those kinds of things. But if I wanted to do a local adjustment, I would do that by going in and selecting the mask. The masking interface looks a little different the first time around because you don't have any masks. So they present it to you kind of in this panel over here. You have your choice of the AI assisted masking things, like pick out the subject in the photograph, pick out the sky, pick out the background, etc. Then what you have in the middle here is what I call the utility players, the brush, the linear gradient, the radial gradient. These are the real components that I mainly use when I'm creating my masks. And then you have range masks, which I'll demonstrate. You have a luminance range mask and a color range mask that you can employ or as a component. If there happened to be a person in this, which I will do an image with a person, under the people thing down here, Adobe will automatically identify that there's a human, and it will automatically build a mask for that human. If you have multiple humans in your picture, it will identify each of the humans that it can find in your picture. So that's a pretty cool little thing. So just to kind of get this started, if I click on the brush component, it says, all right, I have a new mask up here, and it's created by a new brush. And if I roll over the picture, you should be able to see I have a circle on the image. And if I draw on that, I have just created a mask with a brush. And once I did that, if you look back in this little panel over here, now it says mask one has one component called brush one, and you're off to the races. I can keep adding areas onto here and adding to that brush. If you're like me and you end up with a dozen or more masks, you probably want to rename this. So you can go in here and give each mask and each component its own name. So you can, like, especially when you're 10 masks in and you're like, which one did I use to get this guy? To do that. So that's a pretty cool feature. I showed in the slides, if you click on the red dot, you can change the overlay to whatever color you want to change it to, whatever makes you happy. And then you can change the opacity of this, which allows you to see through the overlay to the objects that are underneath. If you go to the three dots, here's your color overlay, which is your default. If I go back down here to white on black, now I get what many people will recognize as a layer mask in Photoshop. Black conceals, white reveals. So the effect will be where the area is in white. Unfortunately, when you're in this mode, you can't see the image underneath your mask. So that's why you kind of work in the overlay, but knowing about this, I'll show you, is a very useful thing to clean up some of the effects that you might run into. And then, I've created a mask with a brush, but I can add in, I'll just do like a radial gradient and I'll add that in. And effectively now the mask first mask now consists of whatever I brushed on plus whatever the radial gradient is, right? So there's two components and they're being added together. But this is where the fun starts. I can also subtract, and I'll just subtract a brush, and I'll just go this way. And now what I've done, this isn't erasing the mask. This is actually creating another component, which is a subtraction from that. And if I go back to this radial gradient, this is the parameter part that I love is I can grab that radial gradient and I can move it. And if you notice, as I do that, the subtract has stayed the same and the subtract moved where it was on the radial gradient. And so that's a beginning hint of some of the interesting power that's buried in this because these things are specified by parameters. And you can move the mask or resize it. So if I went back in and I said, well, I love this radial gradient, but I want to make it slightly more round, I can do that. And you notice that I'm still subtracted because it's like real-time computing the interaction between the brush 2, which is a subtraction component from brush 1 and radial gradient 1. And that's starting to get to the interesting stuff. And again, if you've got questions, like I said, this is kind of choose your own adventure. So if you want to ask, I can try to fit some of this stuff in here. You have a couple options. You can invert your mask. You can duplicate and invert your mask. You can duplicate the mask but not invert it. You can hide the mask. You can delete the mask. You can delete all your masks. This is just like all other things in Lightroom. They're all parametric, meaning don't worry if you screw up, just delete it and keep going and recreate it, right? You're not actually changing the pixels in your image or damaging the pixels in your image or whatever. So in this case, I'm going to just delete first mask and start over again, right? Okay, so one of the things, and I'll talk about select sky. I usually don't do select subject and I don't use select background. They do work, but effectively you're asking AI to find the subject in your photograph. And if you have a prominent subject in your photograph, it's usually going to find it. But I've also had many photographs where it comes back and said, there's no subject in your photograph. And, you know, I'm kind of like, I'm sorry, there is a subject there, but
I think it's trying to tell me something.
yeah, right. So AI is not finding it.
And the other part of while you're on this part of it, and as you go into the sky piece of it, what happens to me sometimes, even if it's like you'd say, like a cityscape, or you know, whatever, and you know, to me, I see a pretty definite difference between where the buildings end and where the sky starts or whatever. Now, but then whenever I do that, a lot of times there's that little bit of kind of muddiness where it's like choosing both. But I'll show you.
I'll show you a couple tricks for that. Yeah, actually.
Big before, if, you know, because on a brush radial gradient, you have the density, etc., the feathering.
Yeah.
But if you choose subject, it doesn't have a feather. And then sometimes it's so harsh, it
Yeah, and you don't have the ability in Lightroom like you do in Photoshop where you can go refine your mask and add a transition zone, like you can blur the edge of the hard mask in Photoshop. So that is one of the differences. My favorite is object. And so what I'm going to do, just so I don't have to explain it in a minute when I do the actual demo on this, object gives you a brush that you can use to paint over what you think the subject is. And so what you're doing here is I'm telling this, I'm telling Lightroom, hey, there's an object here and it happens to be this sphere or this circle, and I've just brushed over it. So I can very accurately kind of draw over and say, I know where my subject is. This is where my subject is. Now you take over and do the masking part. And so in this case, I did an object one mask. The other thing you can do from a brush perspective, that's also useful, and I'm going to turn this mask off, create another one. I'm going to go in with a brush. This auto mask feature down here is kind of interesting. If I draw with the brush, what auto mask does is it looks at the center of that brush, so wherever you see that plus sign, and it says, I'm only going to apply the brush to pixels that look like the pixel that's underneath the brush, the plus sign. So if you were trying to brush around an edge, and so I'm going to go down here, I'll pick the circle up here. And if I start brushing in here, you'll notice that it's keeping the brush, even though I'm overlapping on the outside, it's keeping the brush to the pixels that are on the inside because it's detecting, in this case, it's very simple. It's detecting that there's these gray pixels, and it's making a differentiation between the white pixels. But if I go outside, all of a sudden it's on the white pixels, and now it's kind of doing the opposite, right? So auto mask is very powerful if you know what you're doing. It's also frustrating sometimes if you turn it on, because if you're trying to do a brush, what you'll notice is your brush will have holes in it. And it's because it's trying to select the pixels that are underneath a certain part of the brush, and they don't match everything. And you're like, what the heck's going on? And oh, I got auto mask turned on.
Can you change the sensitivity of that at all?
No, no.
This is Photoshop, like,
Yeah.
but you can use that to just make the brush just a little bit bigger and click. And then it'll just pick the entire, like, middle of the circle or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you could try, and this is fascinating to see the lag when I'm doing this on the screen and on Zoom. Yeah, because I'm rolling the mouse wheel back and forth, and if I didn't have Zoom on, that brush is the size is very, very responsive to my mouse clicking. So I will usually, if I'm going to select something, in this case, I could do a brush and I could try to get it to the right size, and I could try to get the circle. But honestly, it's far easier just to do the object thing and then let Lightroom take over. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do a little fun demo here on this, which is why delete all the masks. So this beautiful image, if you're ever gone to art school or taken an art class, what you have up there are called shapes, or right, and I'm going to turn it into a form. I'm going to try to convince you that this is not just a gray disk on a white background, but I'm going to turn this into a three-dimensional form, and I'm going to use effectively two masks to do that. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about, well, if this was a sphere or a ball or whatever, and I wanted to demonstrate that, how would light hit this? And maybe light's going to come down in this direction where the mouse cursor is. So I might have a bright spot here, and then this part should be in shadow, and it's because of that light and the dark shadow, you would see this and start to appreciate it as a sphere, hopefully. A way to do that would be, I'm going to use a radial gradient. I'm going to put my radial gradient in here. So a radial gradient, the mask is fully in effect in the center, and it's not in effect on the outside. Thing is here, though, I don't want to brighten this. This is actually a very bright image. What I really want to do is darken the shadow areas and leave the bright areas alone. So one of the things I can do from a masking perspective is I can invert the mask. Okay, and so now the mask is fully in effect on the edges of the image, and it's not in effect in the center of the radial gradient. But I have another problem, as you've probably guessed, right? I'm going to darken this whole image, and I don't want to do that. I only want to darken the sphere. And so this is where you would invoke an intersection. And so if I'm intersecting two masks, the resultant mask is going to be where both of the masks, the two that I'm intersecting, overlay with each other. So in this case, excuse me, I'm going to do an object selection. Okay, and I'm going to come in here. Oops. Honestly, let me delete this one and try to do this again. Okay, so I'm going to intersect this one with an object. I'm going to draw on here, and I'm going to do what I just did earlier, which is tell Lightroom, hey, there's an object here. And Lightroom is going to detect that the gray thing is an object. It's going to make a mask the size of the ball, but it's going to intersect the mask on the ball with the radial gradient, right? So now I have two components. One's an inverted radial gradient. The other one is an object selection. And now if I apply the effect, what I can do is add some shadowing to that, right? And part of the power of what we're doing here is I can go back to this radial gradient and I can say, you know, I didn't put the hot spot where I wanted it. I want to push it right, maybe up there. And I can click out, and you can see, you know, it has a different effect on the where the light hits the surface. If I said, well, the light's coming in from the upper right corner, but I really don't want that. I want it from the upper left corner. I can move the radial gradient over here, and it's still doing the intersection with the object, and it's recomputing that intersection, if you will. And now it looks like the light's coming from a different direction. And to me, I had to see a couple demos of this, and when it finally like sunk in, I was like, wow, I can actually go back months later, a year later, and I can completely move these masks around, and I don't have to start from scratch anymore. So maybe to sell the whole deal here, I'm going to put another radial gradient under here, and I'm going to drop the exposure, and I'm going to put a little bit of a shadow right underneath that. That hopefully is what a shadow would look like if the light was hitting it from the upper left corner. The problem I have with this mask is it's actually darkening the lower part of the sphere. So again, what I can do is go in and I'm going to do a subtract, and I'm going to use my friend the object again, and I'm going to take that shadow and I'm going to say, here's my object. And now what I've done is I've removed that black area that was down there, right? And if I'm not happy with the size of this, I can, you know, I can stretch it out, I can change it. And what's interesting is, again, it's recomputing the subtraction between the object selection and the radial gradient that I put in there. Okay, and this is another thing. When you're looking at this radial gradient has 100% feather. I can make it a 0% feather or whatever. And in this case, I'm hitting shift and I'm rolling the mouse cursor back and forth to change that. So just showing you can alter these masks, and a recommendation to learn how to use the keyboard to do this. Okay, so this is like masking 101. I like to start on something like this because you know, understand what each component can do for you is kind of critical to know, like the Lego blocks that you have before you get onto an actual image. So a couple other things I'll show you in here. I can turn individual masks on and off. I can leave those on. But I can't, this isn't a toggle, but if you hold this down, you can see the before and then the after. So that's another nice ability to have. If your overlays aren't coming up, there's a button here. As soon as you go from creating the overlay to putting your effect on the image, this will usually unclick itself so you can actually see what you're doing on the actual image. So sometimes you have to go in and click this on or off. So that's a useful thing. And if you're ever in this and you don't see these lines and these handles around the the specific mask types. On the 3-dot menu, there's a thing called Show Pins and Tool. And if you have it set to never, you'll never be able to reselect this again. So this can be a frustrating thing until you figure this one out. But if you click on that, Show Pins and Tools, I leave it as always. And then whenever I go in, I can do that and see it. And then the last thing I'll show on this diagram, if I go in and create another mask, the other one that's useful is linear gradients, which mask is full in effect, no mask over here. You can control the size of the transition. You can rotate the transition and grab it in the middle and move it. So if you want a very sharp line, you want to put these two things together. If you want a very soft transition, and again, you can reposition and turn it. So that's just another one of the components that you can create the mask from. I'm going to show you color ranges and luminance ranges in the next image. Go back to the library, back to my images, and this one's for Michael. This is an infrared image. This is Canyonlands, Grand Overlook or whatever. The cloud deck was about 1,000 feet below us. So if you walk over that edge right here, it's about 2,000 feet till you hit something. And so this is kind of a more complex image. It's gives us something to look at. When I look at an image that I want to process, I start to ask a question like, all right, how many masks do I think I'm going to need here? And I think in this image, there's 3. I need a mask for the sky because I got to turn that brightness down. I need a mask for the rock because I need to turn that brightness up. And then I need to do something with the foreground. And part of the tricks in this whole masking operation is, how do I get the part of the image that I want to be in mask, and how do I get the mask to be exact or in places where I want it to be. So the first thing you could do here is you could actually do a select subject, and Adobe's smart enough to find out and say, well, okay, your rock is your subject. Okay. In this case, the AI worked. I'm going to rename this one rock, just so we don't forget it. So I have one of my 3 masks. The next mask I might go for is sky. There's also an AI thing here. So if I click here and I select sky, and I'll get the red overlay that will show the sky. But as Michael was saying earlier, if you notice down here, you see some redness on the rocks, right? And you also see some redness on the actual subject itself. So one thing you can do is you can go in here and do a click on this one, do a subtract, and I can do an object selection just to show you that I could select this as an object as well. And what I've done with the sky is I've now subtracted out the rock from the sky. Okay, so that cleans that edge up. But this is a tougher one down here. And this is where the white on black helps you, because there's no doubt that there's areas where the white, which is where your mask is, has encroached, if you will, on your foreground, and you may want to clean that up, right? And there's ways to do that, right? Let me go back to the overlay. There's a couple ways to do it. One of the most interesting ways is I did a sky selection, and I can also do an intersect with sky. And I don't know if you caught the subtleness there, but if I go back to the black and white mode, or white on black, let me delete the second sky. Okay, so you see how much white is here, right? And I do an intersect with sky, it did a much better job. And you can do this a couple times. There's nothing that says you have to stop with one, and you can do another select intersect with sky, and it gets even a little better.
subtracted the sky and then done in inverse?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of funky sky stuff you can do. Like you could subtract the sky from the sky, and then you could subtract that from the sky again. And I show that in like the multi 4 hour class that there's a lot of tricks that you can do along those lines. One thing, you know, when it comes down to it, if you really are up against a rock and a hard place, is you can always subtract and get your utility player out and just brush this in. And this is a case where I have AutoMask selected. This is a case where AutoMask may help you. I went over on this side, right? But I can do an Alt and I can go on the white and do a better job of doing this. One of the tricks of the sky intersect sky kind of thing, if you analyze this in the black and white mask mode, what you'll notice is it doesn't just make the sky selection better. It actually masks out the foreground. It does a better job, but it also degrades the job it's doing on the sky. So it's not a free thing, depending on the image that you're actually looking at. You will see more black or gray start to appear in the selected area on this view or in the overlay. So it's a tool you can use, but it may not be the best tool to use. When it comes down to it, you know, you can sit here and just go in with your brush and actually just subtract out stuff if you really need to. Okay, so once you have, so now we have a mask called Sky, which is very, you know, I mean, this is made up of how many components did I use? 5 components to get the sky. So now I started to think about, well, okay, I got the sky, how do I get the foreground? And one of the things that you want to think about when you do masks, especially if you're doing a sky in a foreground, is don't try to independently select the sky and then independently select the foreground, because invariably the 2 masks will never meet. So if you select the sky, one of the tricks is to go in here and then duplicate and invert. And then if there's any error in the mask, the errors will kind of overlap with each other and you won't get a line, and you have a less chance of getting a halo in there. And so in this case, I'm going to call this one the foreground of doing this. Okay, but I got a problem, right? Because my foreground has what? It has my rock in it. So now I go on this one and I go in here and I subtract, and guess what? I go back to my favorite tool and I say, you know, I'm not paying for CPU power on my computer, so I'll reselect this thing again, and now I'll have the foreground without the rock. So
You can't select another mask.
you cannot, not yet. I'm going to predict, and I'll bet a dozen donuts, that's going to be the next release, is that you can do mask to mask intersections and stuff like that, right? I'm just going to guess on that one. But now if I have all of, you know, I have basically 3 masks, and so now I can start talking about, well, how do I actually want to process this image? And I'm going to do some heavy-handed stuff here, right? But I would brighten the subject, because that's going to make you look at that rock. I'm going to go to the sky and I'm going to darken the sky. And again, I'm being heavy-handed. And then the foreground, I'm probably going to darken that a little bit as well, right? But if I go in now and you know, here's the before and here's the after. Okay. And here you're looking at a dark rock on a bright sky, but here you're looking at a bright rock on a darkish sky. And I think I'm controlling what you're seeing in this photograph at this point. But now let's have a little more fun, right? So if I take the rock, which is just this, I'm going to show you the luminance range. So I'm going to do an intersection with a mask, and in this case, it's going to be a luminance range. And if you've ever done luminosity filter or luminosity masking in Photoshop, this is Lightroom's version of it, okay? So what it gives you is a luminance range slider. It also gives you a sampler that you could start your range, and you could click on part of this. And what you just saw there is it selected all the same luminance kind of in the whole image for a second, but then it did the intersection. So I've already selected the rock, and now I'm just doing a luminance range in the rock. And now what I'm doing is I'm selecting only parts of the luminance range, and I have both a hard stop, set of hard stops, and a set of feather stops, if you will, in this range slider. And so like I could only focus on the brighter parts of the rock. And so in this case, if I take my exposure slider down, I'll turn the overlay off. Rather than turning the brightness up on the whole rock, I'm only turning the brightness up on the lighter parts of the rock. Okay. And so luminance range for me is a wonderful tool to add additional contrast, especially as a black and white person, on different areas.
Quick question around here, because this is, and I know I've talked to Dave Purcell about sometimes the luminosity masking capabilities within Lightroom versus Photoshop. So I will sometimes use, let's say like TK actions and so forth over on the luminosity masking over in Photoshop.
Right.
And then once I get to like what you've gotten to right there, where you've identified specific luminance areas that you want to make your adjustments to.
Yep.
Then I'll go over, I'll take a brush and actually brush it into those areas.
Yes.
Does this have that?
It does.
Okay.
It does. So, so what I can do here is I can intersect this mask with a brush, right? And then should be, yeah. And then I can
Okay.
brush stuff where I want
To
it.
the areas where you want
it.
Once you've identified
Correct.
the luminance areas that you want to adjust, now you can further target it with that.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna take this brush. Well, here, hold on. Yeah, I'm gonna take the brush away. And again, that's another feature. I just took one component off the mask and I left the rest of the mask there. My go-to would be to do an intersection with a radial gradient. And so with a radial gradient, I can draw on here, and then I can like lighten this side of the rock in a way that might convince you, handle, turn, that there's a direction of light happening here, and it's coming from the upper right-hand side of the image, for instance. So here I've done a subject selection or an object selection, same thing. I've done the luminance range to pick the tones that I want to manipulate in that. And then the third component is I've either done a brush or I've done a radial gradient, or you could do a linear gradient. If I was doing a column, when that church I showed, right, I use that same thing, but I used linear gradients because they're columns.
Or their lines, right?
Yep. To manipulate that. And then the other thing I would do, and you can only apply in effect one effect per mask. So another thing I might do here is add a fourth one. I could either duplicate this one, the rock, but then I have all the intersections and stuff to deal with, which may be what I want, but I could also create a new mask. I could do an object again and, just select my rock here. But if I wanted to do a different effect, so in this case, I'm going to bring up the clarity, or sorry, the texture. And that's another trick, especially in the black and white world, is that you change the focus of the image because your eye prefers to look at things that are in focus and sharp. And like I could go back to the foreground and I could, where is it? I could drop the texture on the foreground and kind of blur the foreground. So now I'm controlling where you're looking by controlling the sharpness in different parts of the image, if you will, or the way the relief is done. And as the joke goes, the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders go in both directions. They don't always go to the right. Everybody likes to apply texture and dehaze, but you can also use dehaze to kind of do a little kind of Orton-y effect, if you will, as well. It goes the other direction. So, okay, so that's a fun kind of a complex image. What I like about this is if I wasn't talking through this, I have the freedom to create what you're seeing on the screen in, probably under 2 or 3 minutes on an image like this. And that lets me, that gets me excited because it brings masking and the ability to control image stuff to, to more people, if you will. So this is a fun one. This is a workshop with a model, Everin, and this was a single light workshop, I think, we did over at Raw Studio. And so let's talk about masking and how masking works when people are involved. So I go to develop and I click on the mask. And the first thing you'll notice is down here, it has identified that there's a person in the shot. And it has given me a mask of what it thinks that person is. Now it missed a part of her kind of shoulder area up there. You can see where it's not filled in. But if I click on the identified person number 1, right, I can have a mask for the entire person, or Adobe in their AI is giving you masks for kind of, all the important parts of the person that you might want to deal with, the lips or the teeth or the whites of the eyes, on the iris and the pupils and stuff like that. So you can select the whole person, or you can select just the part of the person that you want. And then you come down here and you say, create the mask, and a mask is created. And so now I have a mask of the model here. And I think in this image that she's a little dark, so I'm just going to use the mask of her to kind of brighten her up a little bit, right? If we go back and we look at this overlay, that it didn't quite get this area in here, and you can cry about it, or you can just go in here, grab a brush, and kind of fill that in or whatever, and take care of that if you're dealing with that. And in this case, if you're a masker in Photoshop, especially of humans, Photoshop gives you the ability to refine edges and stuff like that. You don't have that in Lightroom. So you can go in here and do with a brush or something, you can soften that edge, but it's doing the best it can in terms of identifying who they are. So anyways, I fixed that one. And so if you know anything about lighting people and taking pictures of people or whatever, one of the things that you're going to shoot for is, how do I separate the model from the background? And we were using a single light here, so we got her lit with one light. But if you had 2 lights, what you might do is then shine a light on the background so that you could separate her from the background and kind of create a rim light around her. But through the miracles of masking, right, I can go create a radial gradient, put it on the background, so to speak, and I can brighten that, and I can put a bright spot on the background. Challenge is that I have a human and I just brightened up the model, right? So guess what? I'm going to select people, select her again, create the mask, and now I've put a light behind her, but I've essentially subtracted her from the radial gradient that's behind her. And I've kind of created that effect. And you can argue as to, is it doing the best job and whatnot, but I think it's doing, you know, for a quick edit, that's not bad, right? And again, this was actually the demo. I saw a demo of somebody doing this that really kind of blew my mind. Was if I grab that radio gradient and I don't want it where it's at, and I put it over here, and I click off of this or click out of this, right? It resubtracted that or resubtracted the model away from the radio gradient. And she's a complex mask, right? Now, there are some advanced features like we've detected person one, I've brightened person one up. If you save your develop settings from this and you go to another image with a single human and you apply those develop settings like you would in Lightroom if you're editing like 100 images and you want to change the color temperature on all of them, you can select the develop settings. These masks, what's saved is the parameter. There's a human, one human, you've brightened that human 20 points. So when you get another picture of another human in there, it will go through the AI again, find the other human, which could be completely shaped differently, colored differently, whatever, and it will apply the brightening to that human as well. So that's the parameter kind of mask.
That's actually one of the good reasons to name your masks, because when you do a sync from image to image, you can click on masking and pick subject, background, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And if your masks are not named, you don't know what your masks are. But if they're named, in fact, another thing that drives me insane about Lightroom and doing people is once it picks people and you do hair, lips, eyes, sclera, whatever it is, you would think that when you hit the mask and develop those masks, that since it knows it's hair and clothing and blah, 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 that it would name those masks hair and clothing,
Right.
but it doesn't.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So what's kind of interesting when you sit back and look at this, adding masks to Lightroom is effectively adding layers to Lightroom. And I had an interesting conversation over the weekend with somebody that they're not telling you that they're layers because Adobe doesn't want Photoshop to go away. They don't want Lightroom to compete with Photoshop. So they're never going to tell you that what you're doing here is actually creating layers. You're just implementing it in a different way, in a different interface. So I'm excited to see what comes out next because they fixed a lot of things in the last iteration, and there's several things that I'm predicting they're going to fix in the next iteration. But since we're looking at a picture that has a little color in it, right, if I go back into the masking, I just want to show you, if I create a new mask, there's a color range mask that you can select. And in this case, I'm going to select her blue jeans. And by clicking on her blue jeans, it has selected the color blue. And then you have the ability to refine the different shades of blue. And if I go too far, it will get the whole image, but I can, kind of make the best judgment as to where I want to go. And then you don't have the full color controls that you do in your global edit, but you can certainly change the color temperature of the masked area. You can also change the tint, and you can remap the hues of it as well. So in the range mask, you have luminance and color you can work with. You have another range mask called depth. I've never used it. I think you need. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of the, starts with an L, the LiDAR mapping that the iPhone will now do, which it kind of gives you distance from your camera to the subject or the object.
I mean, if you just think of what he did, he changed the color, the luminance, maybe the saturation, the brightness. Think of how many masks in Photoshop you would have needed to go back and then just change all those individual things with.
Yeah.
You know, and he just did one mask and then manipulated every single one of those things.
Like I said, to me, the magic of what we're talking about here is the speed at which I can do this. And I'm not going to obsess over humans because I usually don't take pictures of humans or furry animals. I'm more of a landscape person or whatever. So you might need to go into Photoshop to do some of those things, but and I do think there is a limit to the number of masks. If you actually like ask Adobe how many masks can you have, they'll tell you it's infinite. But when I get into the 20s and the 30s, I have a M1 Max Studio, 64 gigs of RAM kind of a thing. It starts to get a little pokey. So I think there is some kind of practical limit. But if you're talking 5 to maybe 10 masks, it's wicked fast to do it this way from a procedural as well as as a implementation thing. And then on this image, I'll show you one other trick, and this is kind of maybe to convince you that there's layers are going on here. If I click on the create a new mask, and I click on linear gradient, you would think like I was going to put a linear gradient on the this, and I'd have part of my image under the mask and part of my image not under the mask. But if I actually, and I'm going to delete this one and just because it's going to be faster, if I add a linear gradient, but I start off of my picture and I go off of my picture, effectively what I have is the full mask being applied to my picture. And what that gives me is the ability to make an exposure correction. And then I can create another mask and I can do linear gradient and I can do the exact same thing and I can, maybe drop my blacks or something like that. And I can constrain very precise edits to kind of individual layers like I would do if I were doing this inside Photoshop. And the linear gradient is off the whole image is a way to do that. And speaking of that, one of the other things, if you can add masks outside of the image itself. So like sometimes I'll do a radial gradient up here if I just want to put a bit of brightness in the corner of the image. I can raise the exposure. Let me turn these ones off. And just put a hint of light here. I can zoom all the way out and add that mask, and then I can zoom back in, and I just get like a hint of light coming from the corner, right? You don't the whole mask or the center of the mask or whatever doesn't have to be on the image itself. So. Okay, if we've got go back
If
to
you
my
had that, like that, what you just did there, if you had that in an outdoor setting where the sun is over here, you could actually bring some color into that.
You could. Absolutely.
But yeah, kind of like a light leaf where you have that.
Yeah. Yeah, like the sun is off the planet.
But it's kind of gives it that. Okay.
So I was in Oregon in most of December, and this is an unmodified picture of a sunset in what was the name of it? Brooks, I think, Oregon, just north of the California border. And so we had a couple of really beautiful nights. We were there for like 3 weeks, or the trip was 3 weeks, and maybe I had 3 nights that had color in the sunset. But this is an example of where you can play with color temperature. This is the unmodified image. I can go into develop module. I can click on the masks. And again, very, very quickly, I would probably drop a linear gradient from the top, and I would warm the color temperature of the sky, which is kind of bringing out those yellows. And I could create another mask linear gradient, and I'm gonna bring this one up from the bottom, and I'm gonna cool down the color temperature of the beach. And just with those two kind of masks, right, wow, you should see it on my screen, not up there. It looks a lot better up here. But you can kind of control where the eye is going in the image and shape it. Because again, humans prefer the warmer color tones than the darker blue color tones. And this is an image that I would probably do, if I was doing a quick edit on this, I'm going to do a third mask. I'm going to come in here and do an object. I'm going to go over these rocks because these rocks are all backlit because of course the sun's hitting them on the other side. That's a pretty quick selection right there, right? And again, a little heavy-handed to make sure we can all see it, but I just brighten those rocks up. I jump down here and I put a little texture on them as well to make them nice and crunchy. You know, 3 edits in, and what you're looking at is kind of a radically, I think, a much different kind of photograph, right? To do that.
I think a fun thing to do is on something like this, if you want to do a really quick and dirty sky, like he did, is to do a select sky, play with the thing, and then do a subtract, or you can do a, well, you can just subtract a linear gradient at the very, very bottom, so it looks more realistic. Because both Michael and Eric were talking about how that line at the bottom can be very harsh. But if you either intersect or subtract a linear gradient, then right at where the ocean meets it.
Yeah, so here's where it's overlapping. So I'm just looking, I'm just looking at mask 4, which was the sky selection. And you're seeing that it did an awesome job up here, of course, but it also has some of the ocean down here selected. And it's a two-way street. So pure white is pure selected, pure black is pure unselected. So in this case, it's gray, which means it's partially selected in the black, but it also is gray up in the white area here. So that's not fully selected, but you could come in here and, I mean, there's all sorts of, you can intersect it with a linear gradient. And, let me go back to the overlay here. Right, and so now what I've done is the sky mask went all the way down here, but the linear gradient mask, dies out somewhere in here, and now it's only fully in effect up here. So these are some of the tricks that I go into in a lot more detail and example. You could also come in here if I turn that linear gradient or delete that linear gradient. You could come in here and intersect sky with sky. Again, that's another intersect mask with sky, right? And it will clean that edge up some, but maybe not get it exactly where you want it to be.
Like I said, if you actually select the sky and then subtract the sky,
yeah, so if you
and hit the inverse of the sky, then it'll be very precise.
Yeah, if you so let's take sky 2. So I selected the sky, and then you want me to subtract
the sky.
Yeah, subtract the sky.
What's there is just the haze where you're having the difference.
Yep.
Now take that mask and invert it.
Let me click up here. Okay.
Oh, you did the whole picture, but if you just do the last little invert.
On the
just that one.
Yeah.
So is that the subtract the sky?
That's the invert. That's sky 1, subtract sky 2, and then I inverted sky 2. So maybe I want to invert sky 1.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me take the invert off of that, select sky one, invert that. I don't know, I'm not following,
Yeah.
your secret recipe. Yeah.
You just, so that second, after you subtracted that sky,
Yeah.
that mask, if you take the inverse of it,
So,
What you had before?
so I guess it's sky two, maybe.
yeah, here, we're gonna delete mask 4. I'll give your, we're gonna do a select sky.
Yep.
I'm gonna, sorry,
Subtract sky,
yep, subtract sky
that mask.
and then invert that mask.
That's a very precise.
It's a more precise, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still think if I go in and I do the white on black, this favored a better selection in parts. It still didn't get kind of the ocean in these areas. And it got more gray here. So these are some of the,
Because that's where it's transitioning down
Right.
Yeah.
from the
Right.
sky into
Right,
the
right.
ocean, so I kind of feel like that is pretty good.
That part's kind of belongs, yeah.
yeah. So part of this whole thing is, you know, you're not damaging your image, you're not changing your image when you're playing with these masks. And it might not be your first thought to intersect sky with sky or subtract sky from sky, right? There's a bundle of these techniques that you can use to increase that, your ability to do that. Taking a sky and intersecting it with a linear gradient is another standard move to kind of eliminate those, either better those selections or eliminate some of the halos that you might get from the selection. So a lot of opportunity to play with this and go deeper.
You do something too much, it's gonna degrade the image. I didn't quite catch that.
So do something. I say you're not going to degrade the. Yeah, because it's a Lightroom and you know, the way Lightroom works is you have, if you're editing a raw image, which I'm pretty sure this is still a raw image, Lightroom never even renders your image into an RGB image. It takes the raw image, it kind of makes a temporary RGB image, it puts all of your effects on it, but you actually don't create or manifest those changes to your image until you do an export. And that's confusing to people because sometimes, like, if you go into Lightroom and you make all these changes, and then you say, okay, I'm ready to go into Photoshop, that's an export. And it locks in all those changes. You go into Photoshop, you come back out of Photoshop and you say, well, wait a minute, I had all these changes I did in Lightroom. What happened to those? Well, you went through an export process. But because Lightroom works this way, you know, if all kind of goes to, and I can't see it here because it's off my screen, all goes to hell in a handbasket, you just hit the reset button and it throws all your instructions out. But you've not really modified your image. Where in Photoshop, if you are not careful, you will actually start changing pixels, and then undoing those changes can be a nightmare at times to do that. And then one thing, and this came up, I just taught this class, Lightroom masking class, a week or two ago, but oh, and this one still has masks on it. Let me go in here and delete these. So I had a couple people in the class who were really interested in like bird photography or whatever. So this is a eagle shot, of course, and where do I have it? It's set. I'm gonna go to like 300% here. You know, so this is one of my eagle shots from like 2012 or whatnot. And a lot of times you have a hard time with things like this and getting the mask to work, right? The object mask tool in this is pretty darn good. right? I don't have anything to argue with, there. Maybe there's a little bit in here, right? And what I advise is I will go all the way up to 1600%, which is the most you can get in there. And if you really want to fix something or whatever, I'll just get in there with a brush and start cleaning that up.
That is, subtract a color range.
Yes.
So if you subtract the blue, then you really get a good selection on that.
Yeah, in this case, because this is a very simple image and the blue is fairly, I can, to that point, I can do a color range selection and get the inverse of the bird, basically, by selecting the sky. So in this case, the sky selected and the bird's not. And if I blow up, there's a little bit of range here, which I probably can get by adjusting the kind of range of the color stuff. So, okay, any other questions?
I'm trying to think of like, I'm back on the luminosity masking. What I'm trying to figure out is like how much I can get away with in the Lightroom and not have to use some of the programs I use over in Photoshop. So for instance, like whenever I do, I'll just bring up the example of, on a landscape image, and if I go into TK Actions and I do a luminosity mask of, say, a certain range of midtones,
Right.
and if I want to apply like a curves adjustment within that, is that something? Can you do like a curves adjustment within the Lightroom on a luminosity mask, or
Yeah.
still a Lightroom thing, or a Photoshop thing?
So here's a C-stack, right, that I can go in and do an object. In this case. Okay, so fairly decent selection of the object. I could play with the exposure a little bit, but right here is a curve adjustment,
Right.
right? So I can, if I wanted to kind of do your standard boost the contrast thing, right? I could do that, but I can also come in here and take the object selection and I can intersect it with, a luminance range. And so maybe I can come in here and just get the brighter parts of the image, right? And then this is a little funky, but you kind of grab these and then grab them a second time. So what this says is there's no selection in this part of the luminance range.
Okay.
There's a gradient selection in this part. And then past this one, it's kind of fully selected.
Okay.
Right? But then your effect, and the first iteration of masks did not have curves.
Okay.
They had the ability to create masks and all that, but then they did another update where they introduced the curve tool.
Okay.
So if you're like a Greg Benz fan who
Right.
he does all his images or his editing with luminosity masks and curves, which there's a certain beauty to doing that, right? Because you have one tool, the curve tool, and then you apply the mask and do that. And so when they introduce this one, I'm like, all right, now we're cooking with gas because now I can control the contrast, And then again, I've edited this image. This is one of the images I won an international award off of. I wanted to light only this side of the image, right? So I came in here and I just intersected it with a radial gradient, and I put my radial gradient just on this side of the image, and just use that as a way to control the shape of the light and the direction of the light. Yeah.
Okay.
Michael?
Yep.
The luminosity mask in Lightroom work really well if you use the eyedropper
Okay.
to select the range that you're wanting to affect.
Okay.
You can really get some pinpoint, and then with your visibility turned on, you can really see how exactly how dense it's affecting that range, like when you turn, you know, like. you
Right,
said,
yeah, so I just, sure,
You can see the little red
You'll
now.
you'll
Yep.
start to see where
Oh, okay,
gradient
okay.
versus full.
right, okay.
I'll turn the brightness up so it translates better.
Yeah. Well, like I said, this is, I just haven't done much of my luminosity masking adjustments in Lightroom. I've always just gone to Photoshop, and like you said, either Lumenzia or TK, Lumenzia is the Great Benz one, but yeah, the other one.
Right.
Using those to do some of those things, but to know that, you know, maybe a little bit simpler or, you know, to do it over here.
So frustrations is that this is not a bigger tool, if you will. Like it's pretty hard to get the thing exactly where you want it to be. That's number one. And then the other thing, and again, this is another prediction, is it would be great if Adobe put you know, whatever Lumenzia or whatever action that you're using in Photoshop usually gives you 6 brights
Yep.
or 6 highlights, 6 darks, and 6 midtones.
Right.
So all of those translate into different placements of the selected region and the feather.
Yep.
So it would be trivial to put up a little grid up here where you could just say, I want highlights 1, or I want highlights 2.
Yeah, that's.
Right? That would be like a super trivial thing for them to do from a guy who wrote software for a living for 35 years.
Sure.
You know, to pre-program those numbers so you wouldn't have to do that. So I'm also thinking that's one thing I'm looking, I would expect them to do. Yeah. When I first saw it without the curve tool, I was like, oh, well, that's okay, you know, and then sure enough, the next update came with the curve tool. But this would be trivial. If you've seen the new selection, they have a new luminance selection in the newer versions of Photoshop. If you go into the color selection, one of the drop downs is luminance, and then they have
Right.
highlights, midtones, and shadows. And then you click on those 3, and then you'll get an interface that looks almost identical to this interface right here.
Okay.
And then you can bump them back and forth, right? And if you've ever used other tools like Affinity Photo, you don't create the luminosity. You create the luminosity mask by specifying the numbers, much like you do here.
Okay.
So this isn't locked into like Photoshop doing this or Adobe doing this. Other editors do it this way as well.
Yeah. You know, build better refinement, but I kind of gave up on the TK stuff and use this. It's just it's easier.
And then, yeah.
It may not be as precise, but
Because like in Photoshop, when you're doing it, you paint through the selection for the effect. And in this case, if I come back and I say, no, I'm selecting too much of the rock or you know, I can literally come back tomorrow and just bump that and I'm done. Versus having to go back in and say, well, which curve was it? Which selection was I using to modify the layer mask that's associated with that curve? And then how do I paint to do that differently?
Right.
I can come back in a year and change this and totally
It's still there.
it's
still there.
parameters that, yeah, because it's parameterized. Yeah, you can come back in and just kind of change it around a little bit.
You have all that you processed, or you have all your masks that you could show us and walk us through just quickly, maybe what mask you did.
So this is a fun image. This is downtown Denver. Turn these masks off. Well, hopefully you saw the image beforehand, right? This is looking up. This is the Brown Palace. So this is where I'm at. And this was a daylight shot. So this is kind of some of my architectural work that I'm playing around with.
Not infrared? No, because you have the color.
Yeah, no, this was just like 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was walking through, and I originally was going to take the lamp out because I just thought it was a beautiful image of the four buildings kind of going up to the sky. And then I decided to leave the lamp in, and of course the lamp wasn't on at 9 o'clock in the morning, so I turned the lamp on by using masks.
And then there's the representation of how the light is.
It's hitting the buildings. And this is one of these things where, depends on how analytical you want to get. This is like a 100-story building over here. There's no way that the light from this light is, right?
Exactly.
But until I told you that, you probably didn't like fixate over that, right? Okay. So, if I go into the masking interface, you'd have to count them, how many masks that I've used in this file. Right, it's definitely more than one screen. And so if I browse through these, you can see like I've masked that side of the building, I've masked that side of the building. Right, you can see as I kind of go through the whole image and go around the image, there's the masking of the sky, things like that, right? And so each one of these this one was constructed with the brush. Some of these I have copies where I actually have effects assigned to them. I've intersected with a linear gradient. So this building, which I've selected somewhere down here.
Yeah, because that's got to be multiple.
Picture black and white. And then and that's the work. And so this was funny. I showed this in this. I took this. If you guys know, I've run across Juliana Gosperdow. I'm probably butchering her last name. Her editing is very much in this style. Her and Joel Tinchelier do a lot of work that's kind of reminiscent of this. This is kind of my version of her work in doing that. And I just took a class from her, and she's totally 100%, you have to do it in Photoshop. And I never told her that I did it all in Lightroom. Okay, but this is probably by number the most complex I've done. And
The lights in that one building to the left, in there, you had to do this. No, yeah, I understand, but the other highlights in there, yeah.
The natural thing at 9 a.m, you wouldn't have had. You had to create all that and.
Well, so I did. So some of this, let me get this zoom cam out of the way. So if I took all the masks off, all you're seeing is my global edit. But if you look at that building on the left,
Yeah,
there is some light there.
Okay, and you're just able to emphasize.
I'm just able to emphasize that by doing it. The bright edge was a pain in the rear because that's the sun actually coming through the buildings kind of horizontally and just clipping that edge. Right, so I had to work to decrease that. But like in this stuff, I have not gone through and done individual masks around each of the individual buildings or anything like that. I've literally just got the side of the building, and I'll let up on this. I've literally just got the side of the building. And then in most cases, like this one up here is really obvious. This is a linear gradient. I did a selection of the building. So I did an object selection of the side of the building, and then I combined that with a linear gradient.
When you do your fine art in black and white art, do you edit in color and then convert to black and white, or do you do a black and white conversion and then edit that through profiles or whatever?
So it kind of depends. In the case when I have color, I will do enough editing in color. If I know I'm going for black and white, and I have this whole talk I give of, I don't create black and white accidentally. Right, so there are people who will take a picture with their camera and then they'll go, well, this looks like junk, and I'm going to convert it to black and white to see if it's better. Or there's people that will say, well, I'm going to try it in black and white because that makes it look old timey. or it makes it look like it's a fine art image. I go out with my camera with the intent of capturing a black and white image. And I think from the get-go that I'm going to make a black and white image. And I have a whole talk on understanding color and color relationships and all that kind of stuff. And then how you, and one thing about color, right, is it's very important. Color is important to us as humans, both from a survival lizard brain thing, like you don't eat a purple apple because your mind is going to tell you that that's something wrong with it. Apples are either red or they're green, right? And if it's any other color, your mind is going danger, right? School buses are yellow. We've agreed that they're all going to be yellow, and we've agreed what tone or what shade of yellow they're going to be. So if I take a color image, I can only process it so far. If I make a school bus green, you're going to look at me and say, well, you're nuts. School buses aren't that color green. And then you're going to argue with me. But if I take that school bus and I render it in black and white and I give it a tone and it's darker or lighter, you're not going to argue with me over that.
In terms, let's just say this image right here. So if I had a blue sky and I know it's blue, and I'm starting to edit in color, so then I go to the panel and I go down to luminance. I darken the blue as dark as I can,
Yeah.
and I know it's gonna turn out to be like I'm putting on an old time red filter and it's gonna turn Ansel Adams black like this.
Yeah.
But I know that on a color image, I'm not actually doing it on a black and white image. So that's what my thought process
Right.
was.
So I'll do that. To separate the tones, because when you do the black and white conversion, you can use that as a way to pull your tones apart, and make sure that there might be two things in your image that are colored differently but have the same tone. And by amplifying the color, you can actually separate those so that when you do convert to black and white, it turns out it doesn't matter whether you do it in color and then convert it to black and white, or you do it in black and white and then use the black and white color editor here. This just lets you see it in black and white while you're manipulating the tones.
I guess the reason I asked that question specifically because you have such fantastic black and white fine art photography is I almost always do my conversions in Silver Effects Pro. So I'm almost always, well, sometimes I'll do a profile here during the develop module
Right.
to get me into black and white, but I'm still more or less never taking it to black and white until I go to Silver Effects,
Right.
where I know I can go in and whatever effect I use, then go to the filter panel and then start screwing with those things like that.
Yeah, the only advantage I see to Silver Effects, and honestly, I'm still on like version 3, is the U-point technology, is in effect combining image manipulation with luminosity masking. If you think about what you're doing, and I got so upset because I upgraded to like version 6, and I literally they took away some of the editing capabilities that you had with the U-point technology and the FX stuff, and I was literally on the phone screaming at them, saying, "Give me my license back. I do not want this upgrade." And they're like, "Whoa, we can't do that, sir." And I'm like, "Bullshit." And so that's the only reason I will go into Silver Effects. I understand Silver Effects has a bunch of presets and a slightly different interface. And they still offer like the zone editing, so you can select, Ansel Adams zone system kind of selections and things like that. But to me, I get all of that in Lightroom. It's just presented differently, so it's kind of like one tool, and then I don't have to use a separate tool to do that. But yeah, so I really don't use it. I can't remember the last time I pulled something into Silver Effects. I create my effects here. But I do, so the, you know, if I rewind back to your question, I also have two digital cameras that take images in black and white only. So I will start from a black and white file and then there is no color. I mean, if you want to manipulate colors or tones, you got to put a filter on the front of the lens.
I was gonna ask, I think we mentioned Leica was one of yours. They have like a pretty high-end black and white only. Is that the one that you're using?
Yeah, so I have the the two main cameras I use for this kind of work. I have a Leica M11, which is 61 megapixel. Their latest and greatest color camera.
Okay,
But then I have an M11 monochrome,
okay.
which it's the exact same camera without the Bayer array, and it shoots only in black and white.
Yeah, and that's the one that I've heard as far as its range and what it do. It's not that the R camera is non-like it can.
No, I mean, yeah.
But I've heard that one is like really top end for.
Yeah, there's a. And it depends how much you want to geek out on this and the whole Bayer array and all the math you do to reinvent color and all that. So the monochrome cameras just bypass all of that. And it's arguable. They're also a little bit sharper because you know, so there's technical reasons why it's kind of exciting to use those. It is a hefty investment for something that only shoots
Right.
black and white though.
But black and white is your thing.
It's your jam, and yeah, it's something that you might want.
Okay. Any other questions? I think we're got to the end.
Yeah,
Eric, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Great presentation and